Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you've ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. Since 2009, our radio program hosted guest experts from around the globe sharing their perspectives, experiences, and expertise while giving you food for thought. If you can't listen live, then download and listen to any of our 300-plus podcasts in our library at texasconflictcoach.com. So sit back, relax, or join the conversation every Tuesday evening, or tweet us at TXConflictCoach.
In many situations, we see our decisions as an either-or dilemma. Author and Ph.D. Bernie Mayer argues in his new book, The Conflict Paradox, 7 Dilemmas at the Core of Disputes, that the real challenge is to find a new path that incorporates both approaches. These apparently opposing conflict practices need not be mutually exclusive. In fact, each is necessary to the other. Hello, I'm your guest host, Stephen Kotov, and joining us again for our program entitled Either Or and the Conflict Paradox is mediator, professor, and author Bernie Mayer. Bernie Mayer is a professor of dispute resolution at the Werner Institute, Creighton University. For over 30 years, he's been a leader in the conflict resolution field. Bernie has facilitated many complex environmental conflicts, commercial and organizational disputes, interpersonal conflicts, public decision-making processes, and has an extensive background in family mediation as well. He is a founding partner of CDR Associates, a pioneering conflict intervention firm located in Boulder, Colorado. Bernie is the author of many books and articles, including The Dynamics of Conflict, a guide to engagement and intervention, Beyond Neutrality, Confronting the Crisis in Conflict Resolution, and Staying with Conflict, a strategic approach to ongoing disputes. His newest book, The Conflict Paradox, 7 Dilemmas at the Core of Disputes, has just been published earlier this year by Josie Bass and the American Bar Association. Bernie lives in Kingsville, Ontario, and Boulder, Colorado. Welcome back to the show, Bernie.
Thank you, Stephen. It's great to be back.
We will always make time for you, Bernie. It's always a pleasure to have you with us and to hear what you have to say. And so, you were on with us last year, and we were talking about the riddle of principle and compromise, which is one part of your new book that's just come out, The Conflict Paradox, 7 Dilemmas at the Core of Disputes. And so this is your 5th book that you've published. Have you always been drawn to writing and publication?
Well, I think the further on I've got into my career, the more I have. I think maybe in principle I like the idea of writing, but I'm not sure I had that much clarity about what I wanted to say early on. But what drew me more and more into writing is realizing more and more that I was learning a lot from my practice that I wanted to put down. And in particular, I was learning a lot about the disconnects between how we often expressed ourselves, or the theories or concepts we often put forward about conflict, and what we actually did. And trying to bring those two things together was really an important motivation for me to write. So I guess I started in the late 90s more seriously thinking about writing.
Well, it's something that I think really speaks to what you've done and still what you have left to accomplish, because every time you write something, it's really, really insightful. And I want us to now talk about your latest book and this concept of either or. Could you give us your thoughts first about why it's important for us to identify this either or thinking and understand that better?
Well, let me just maybe take a step back to say what my basic purpose with the book was, and then get to the either-or, because it kind of derives from that. I have struggled over the years to kind of get to the essence of what we do. And the closer I can feel like what it is that we really do is intervening in conflict, almost no matter what our role is, but as people are intentionally trying to help people with conflict. I've tried to look at the obstacles, the opportunities, the concepts we use, And this book was my effort to say, what is it that we do that really makes a difference in how people approach conflict? And there's obviously a lot of things. I don't want to just say it's one thing we do, but I think the thing that makes the biggest difference over time is we help people think differently about conflict. Mm-hmm. And in order that we have to do that, we have to be able to think differently about it ourselves. And what I think happens to people in conflict, all of us, even no matter how well trained we are, is that when we are faced with a conflict, one that we are emotionally engaged in, one that we care about, we tend to see our choices as these polarities, as these either-or choices, as you put it. Mm-hmm. And we feel like we have to make a choice between one or another of a fundamental approach to conflict, almost no matter what kind of conflict it is. And when we make a difference is when we can help move people beyond their polarized way of thinking about things, to see a kind of a greater unity, a greater whole. Now, one of the things I think we often do, however, as conflict interveners, is we are confronted by a polarity where people are landing on one side of it, like thinking they need to compete, and we take the opposite side, which is we say, no, what you really need to do is cooperate. And in a way that when we do that, we're falling into the same problem, and failing to see the nature of the paradox, which is that you can't compete without cooperation, you can't cooperate without competition. And that's that. And when we can really get that, when we can really understand that, and when we can therefore help people work beyond the either-orness of it, then we can slowly, sometimes rapidly, but often very slowly, help people think about conflict differently. And that's what I think over time really makes a difference. A lot of the things that we do, helping people work out some of their differences about what they're going to do about a particular issue, or hear each other, or tell their stories, or express some of their emotions, they're very important, but the end result that they live with, that makes a difference over time, is they've broken through their polarized view of what's going on in conflict.
And this is what I think is really interesting, and I hope our listeners are able to start to wrap their head around it, because it's in a sense this concept of interdependency, in that you need both. For whatever it is, competition or cooperation or optimism or realism, you have a whole list of 7 dilemmas that you've got in your book. But each one is you can't have one without the other. And if I'm hearing you right, it's that one of the first pieces of advice you have for folks is just to identify that paradox exists. Is that right?
That's correct, and you're right. You can't have one with the other because they're part of each other.
And why don't you just go ahead and say a little bit more about that? Because I think that's really fundamental to a lot of what you want folks to understand is that, if you go to one end or the other, that's also, not going to help folks, right?
Right. Let me say that one word I tried to avoid in this book, not sure I avoided it entirely, but I tried to, was the word balance. Because balance gives the idea that you have, you have 3 parts of cooperation, 2 parts of competition, and 1 part indecision, and you end up with a whole that's what we're looking for, and that's not it. It's understanding that each of these are really wrapped up in each other. So let me take an example many people are familiar with from the physical sciences, which is light. Is light a particle or is light energy? And and in fact, the paradox is that it can't be both energy and a particle, and yet it is. And it depends how we're looking at it. So that's my analogy here, is that each of these things are things that we need to be both of. We talked last time I believe, about principle and compromise. How you can't
Yes.
you can't be principled without compromise, and yet compromise is meaningless without a principle guiding it. But this is true of many other of these basic paradoxes. And as people progress, become more mature, develop their capacity to handle conflict, or work their way through a particularly difficult conflict, they've got to get past that. I mean, we are seeing today, as you and I are talking, one of the most intense efforts to figure that all out in terms of the negotiations with Iran about nuclear weapons. And there are probably people staying up overnight in Europe trying to figure this all out while we're talking. And here's the point. We will not have a good solution to this without compromise, but it will not be a good solution if that compromise is not laced with principle.
And so, you're trying to get folks to shy away from balance. And is it that first and foremost, it's to understand that the extremes aren't the answer, that understanding how one is dependent on the other, that's one of the crucial parts to, in a sense, helping folks think differently about how they handle these circumstances or these problems or these situations. Is that right?
Well, I don't know if I'd quite go and say the extremes aren't the. I mean, there may be times when you have to be extremely competitive, or you have to take extreme risks to cooperate in a very competitive environment. So I wouldn't necessarily say this is never about the extremes. It is about seeing the integrated reality. That every time, for example, that you are trying to be extremely rational and logical about how you approach a problem, you had better bring your emotions into it, or your logic will be good for nothing.
And it's funny because, for folks from the general public, you may or may, and this may not be apparent to you, but for folks like Bernie and I who deal with conflict all the time, it's absolutely the case. If you don't acknowledge the emotions that people are dealing with, you can be as logical as you want, but that stuff's going to bubble up. So let's go through all the dilemmas, Bernie, and since they're a central theme, and then we can talk about how they affect our thinking. We've got competition or cooperation, right? And then we've got optimism or realism, avoidance or engagement, principle or compromise, emotion or logic, neutrality or advocacy, and finally autonomy or community. So it sounds like no matter what situation you're in, from a family crisis to a corporate dispute or even geopolitical negotiations like you just mentioned with Iran, all these dilemmas are some part of the situation. Is that right?
They're always present in one way or another. We're always competing and cooperating. We're always figuring out how to be both optimistic and realistic. And to just name the first two you mentioned. And I'm not saying these are an exclusive list. You could come up with other ones. In fact, the last chapter I suggest what some of those might be. But these are the ones that I think are the most universally prevalent in all situations that we're in conflict about. We are always having to figure out some of this stuff, and it's in many ways each of these are basic to our human interactional system. So, for example, community and autonomy, which is the last one I believe you mentioned, that's the basis of developmental psychology. That is how we grow. That, by figuring out how to find a way of being both solidly placed within our community and solidly clear about our autonomy, and how our autonomy helps us to be part of a community and how our community helps us realize our autonomy. And you could just look at almost every modern approach to developmental psychology, and you'll see it's laced with this stuff. And you can just think about adolescence as a time where all of this stuff about, how autonomous I am versus how much am I connected to my family or my community of peers bubbles up and creates a fairly intense pattern of family interactions, and that's exactly what it's about.
Well, I want to remind our listeners that they're listening to the Texas Conflict Coach blog talk radio program with your guest host, myself, Stephen Kotev. Today I'm joined by Bernie Mayer, and we're discussing EitherOr and the conflict paradox. And, Bernie, what I loved about your last statement is, to me, what I find so fascinating about working with conflict is that, in some sense, we're getting to the guts of human existence. You're talking about this autonomy versus community, sort of it's the individual versus the group, but also, who am I and how do I fit in with somebody else? And these, to me, are sort of age-old questions that people have been trying to figure out for a long time, and they may be in certain brackets. This may be a philosophical question, or here's some religious insight or spiritual insight, or, this is how, a psychologist would look at it. But in many circumstances, these are the challenges that people deal with all the time, no matter where they're at.
All the time, no matter where we're at. All of us do.
And that's what I think is really wonderful about what you've done here.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's interesting, Stephen. Let me just share one thing. That I wrote this chapter on optimism and realism.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It must be a year ago now because of all the time it takes for this stuff to get to editing and production, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And for the last several months in my family, there's been a significant medical issue that we've had to deal with. And I actually went back and reread that chapter because I think a lot of people will be able to relate to this. Because on the one hand, you want to approach all the stuff that you might need, serious medical issues with people you love, with a real sense of hope and optimism. But if that hope and optimism is not based and fundamentally grounded in realism, it doesn't work very well as optimism. And similarly, if people take the view of, well, you just got to be realistic about all of that, and it's not grounded with some hope that things can be better or can change, or you have or something to look forward to, then it's probably not very realistic either. And it's been very intense how I've experienced that, months and months after I wrote this thing, and I think we all have those moments. We have it as with people in our family. We have it about issues or concerns we care about. Or we have it with organizations. We have it like, for example, if we want to face the issue of climate change, we had better be both of those things. And as conflict interveners, when we go into a situation with clients, they want us to believe we can help them. They want us to convey some optimism. I've said many times in my life, optimism is an ethical responsibility of conflict interveners.
Yes.
On the other hand, they don't want us to be naive.
Right.
They don't want us to go in there and say, I think we can get an agreement here. Oh, you folks are making progress. You've agreed about who's going to go first or something like that. It doesn't work because it's not grounded in realism, and people quickly lose faith in our optimism if that's the case. So, I mean, you can go through all of them, and I do in the book, and talk about each of these, but I think there's things we face every moment we're dealing with a conflict or intervening in a conflict or dealing with a life struggle.
Well, you know what, but more than anything, my personal goal in every program I do is to give some folks some practical, okay, so here's a wonderful concept, here's a wonderful idea. What do we do with it? And when I think about what our listeners would do to deal with these dilemmas, the thing that hits me is that understanding these paradoxes is really a wonderful tool to help you make better decisions. Because as I'm listening to everything you're talking about, it's sort of like you got to make a decision, either in your personal life. Okay, I'm in the midst of my family. We're having this family medical issue that's going forth. How am I going to live my life? How am I going to make decisions, if we've got to go and talk to a medical provider? All those things, are rife with these paradoxes. But if you can, it sounds like it's like if you can wrap your head around the fact that they exist and that they're all connected, that's going to help you make better decisions when you really need to. Is that right?
Well, sure, absolutely. I think that you start by looking I started by looking at what I saw clients dealing with and what I saw me struggling with in terms of the actual choices you think you have to make in conflict, in terms of how you're going to deal with it, how you're going to understand it, how you're going to approach it. And if you start by identifying what you think those choices are, and then try asking your question, what if this isn't really a choice? What if I don't have to choose whether to cooperate or compete, or to be logical or deal with emotions, or to be principled or to compromise, or to avoid or to engage in conflict? What if I don't have to make that as a decision? What if the answer is, how do I integrate doing both, because I'm always doing both?
Right.
That it actually, and in the book there's all sorts of examples, and there's a lot of, for each of these there's particular ways you can think about some of it and stuff you can do, but that's the basic approach, I think. You start by saying, let me get beyond thinking this is a choice I have to make. It's not either A or not A. It's both A and not A. That's why it's a paradox.
Well, let's dig a little bit deeper, because you talked about what was in the book and sort of some examples, but also it sounded like some actual things that the readers could do of the book. Can you sort of elaborate a little bit more about what that is in case people are curious?
Well, let me just maybe pick the first one on competition and cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
We, in fact, know a lot about this. That's one of the ones in the field that I think we've actually grappled with a lot. And we've done a lot of experiments about that. Some of them have been using kind of game theory, like Prisoner's Dilemma, for example.
And let me just explain that to folks real quickly,
sure,
for the public who hasn't heard it. The concept is that you've got two folks who are in prison, and they have to make a decision about whether or not they're going to work together, or they're going to go and just basically try to take care of themselves and, in a sense, harm the other person in prison. And there's sort of different things that go with it, where, if they work together, it's not that bad of an outcome. Everybody turns out okay. Or if you betray somebody else, one person does really well and the other person does terribly, but at the end of the day, it's kind of a dead end. But go ahead, Bernie. I don't know if I did that 100% justice, but that's the basic gist of it.
That was the best 30-second description of Prisoner's Dilemma I've ever heard.
So go ahead and pick up from there.
I probably shouldn't even mention it, because it's opening up a can of worms. But the point is, what we can learn from these is that the real trick is, if you want to cooperate, the challenge is, how do you cooperate? How do you offer a conciliatory, cooperative move? Iran, we're going to let you keep a certain amount of your centrifuges and still take away sanctions, let's say. How do you make a move that is genuine, that is large enough, that really makes a difference, without it being so big and so large that if you get sandbagged, if you get then said, fine, we'll take that and we won't do what you want anyhow, you haven't made yourself overly vulnerable. And if you look at the political statements and the cartoons about this, on the one side, it's like, oh, look at what a naive president we have. And on the other side, it's, look at all these other people who just want to be warmongers. And the fact is, a good approach is one that offers cooperation, is clear about let's say consequences or provocability, is the way it's sometimes referred to, and is also clear to move on, to accept what's happened in the past and move on to the future. And the mistake we make all the time is, for example, we cooperate without implying any competitive capacity, and then somebody kind of jerks us around, and then we threaten hellfire and damnation, or we've lost the cooperative element. And I think what mediators, for example, have to do is they have to help people offer conciliatory gestures in significantly large enough chunks, but in a way that doesn't overly make them vulnerable. And that's very hard to do in real life, but it's one of the things that we do to try to handle that one. And so that's just an example from that one chapter. I mean, I could also talk about how let's take emotion and logic.
Well, hold on. Before you go there, I just want to. One thing that really strikes me about this is that it's this thing of that people want to make wise decisions. They want to make the best decision they possibly can, but one that actually has kind of taken some things into account and is, in a sense, the best course of action that they could have. And I really feel that that's again and again sort of what you're trying to set the stage for. If it's somebody who's never worked with a conflict intervention specialist or somebody who's got an expertise in conflict, okay, well, how could this person help you? Or if they buy your book and they're sitting down saying, well, what do I do with it? It's like if I follow through with these things, it's going to put me at a spot. It's going to take me to a place where I could hopefully make a much wiser decision, because it's, I would say grounded is the word that really comes to me. You're grounding yourself in these different things. You're owning that they exist, and then from there you're making a decision.
Well, that's right. I mean, that's what I hope. That's certainly what I hope. One of my previous books, which you're well acquainted with, is called Staying with Conflict. And one of the things I really liked, which is how you deal with ongoing conflict. Conflicts are not going to end. One of the things I really liked about it was that a number of people, quite a few people, said to me, that book changed how I practice. Now, this book hasn't been out long enough to see if it has the same impact, although at least one or two people have already said that to me. That's my goal, isn't to really change everything about you, how you practice, but it's to change something about the anchor you bring or the keel you bring as you sail through conflict that will help you act in a more sophisticated way and help your clients, therefore, act in a more sophisticated or mature way, if you want.
Well, and I also see it as, part of what I think is valuable about understanding conflict is that you're understanding people and you're understanding society better. So if you're in a leadership position, and say if someone who's listening is a manager, and they're like, well, how do I deal with my employees better, or how do I make a decision that's better? Understanding this paradox is just as crucial for somebody who's just starting out in life, or wants to know what to do with their grandparents or their grandchildren and everything in between. And so, that to me is what I think is most profound about a lot of what you're doing here is that you're putting things out in front of folks that they may or may not have tied together, and then you're giving them, in a sense, a path to follow to start to process these things for themselves. And that to me, I think, is just incredibly powerful.
Well, certainly what I'm trying to do, Stephen. I really appreciate that.
Well, as we're starting to wrap up here, folks who are listening in, they've got a taste for things, and they want to either do more or learn more or take this a little bit deeper. What assignment? We have this assignment for the week for our listeners. What would be your assignment for the folks who are listening today or listen to this program in the future?
I think what you should do is take a look at a conflict that you're part of this week. It's even better if it's one that you're not an intervener in, but you're a party to. Although any kind is certainly okay. But the one where you really have some skin in the game on is what I'm talking about. And just experience, kind of think about it. Breathe a little bit, experience what you're feeling about the conflict, and then ask yourself, what other choices I think I have to make in order how I approach this. Should I avoid it or should I engage in it? Should I give an open conciliatory message, or should I let somebody know, up with this I shall not put? What kind of choices do you think you have to make? And then ask yourself, what if I didn't have to make that choice? What would that look like? And see where that takes you.
So just follow that last bit a little bit further. So they say, okay, what happens if I don't have to make that choice? What do you want them? What is the piece that they are going to do after they make that decision? Is that then take a look at what you want to do again? Like go back to your initial decision and see if that's the
all right. Maybe that is maybe I have another choice now. Maybe I have a more sophisticated iteration of the choice. Choices never go away, but maybe I have a more sophisticated iteration of it. So, for example, maybe I have to say to somebody some way in which it is clear that I'm not willing to put up with something and I'm really trying to work with them because I want to help them deal with their needs. How do you do that? In fact, it doesn't mean anything if you do the one without the other. It has no meaning and no power either way.
So basically, by doing that with whatever the problem is they're dealing with, it's a chance for them to go and take a look at it again, and then see, hey, is that still the decision I want to make, or maybe there's another decision that I can come up with.
Right. And you can think about it in terms of these 7 dilemmas, but you don't have to. I mean, another one that people really might want to think about is when I'm feeling really emotional and I'm feeling I have to control my emotions and take a more logical approach, try asking yourself, how do I feel my emotions in a way that helps me be more logical?
Well, you've definitely piqued my interest, and I hope everybody else's interest has been piqued about everything that you've talked with us today. For folks who want to reach you, for folks who want to know about how to find the book and how to find you and how to find out more about all this information, how can folks get in contact with you? Where can folks find your book? Tell us all that good stuff.
Well, you can go to this is jointly published by the American Bar Association and Josie Bass. It's the first joint publication of these groups ever. You can go to either of their websites, but the easiest thing to do, honestly, is to go to Amazon.com, type in my name, and see what pops up. However, if you want to hear a little more about me and what I've been doing and a little bit more description of the book, you can also go to the ADR Hub website, which is a website for conversations on conflict issues. It's hosted by Creighton University, but ACR is involved with it, and it has a lot of really interesting parts to it. And you'll find information there about the book as well. If you want to email me about it for any reason, my email is berniemeyer@creighton.edu. Creighton is spelled Creighton.
And I also want folks to remember that not only does Bernie have this current text that he's just put out, but he does have a couple others here that we mentioned before that are all worth taking a look at. The Dynamics of Conflict, Beyond Neutrality, Staying with Conflict. These are all different ways of digging a little deeper into this. So if you're somebody like Bernie and myself who are, dedicated, conflict specialists and conflict resolution practitioners, it's almost required reading. If you're a general member of the public and you find this stuff fascinating, either because you're terrible at dealing with, problems and disputes and you want to get better at it, or you're somebody who actually seems to be pretty good at it, but you want to take it to your next step, I can't recommend Bernie's work any more highly than I don't know how else to say, because I think it's really great. So, Bernie,
I really appreciate that.
Well, as I said before, you're always welcome to come on the show. Every time it's a lot of fun. Every time it's another interesting thing to learn and engage with. And you've taken us through a whole range of what the paradox is like, how, in a sense, by owning this paradox or acknowledging this paradox, it's central to making decisions. With all those things said, what is your closing thoughts for us as we wrap the program up?
Well, I thought I might close with 2 quotes of other people that are in the book. The first is from Niels Bohr, a famous physicist from the pre-World War II era, critical to the development of modern atomic theory. And he said, "How wonderful that we have met with a paradox. Now we have some hope of making progress." And the other is from F. Scott Fitzgerald. Many of you may find this quote somewhat familiar, but that's who actually said it. "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold 2 opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function." And I would say the test of our maturing as human beings, as peacemakers, as conflict specialists, and as disputants who are trying to do a good job in managing conflict is our ability to hold two contradictory realities in place at the same time, and realize they don't even contradict each other when you dig deep enough.
Well, thank you again, Bernie. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it, Stephen.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you've enjoyed the program. You can find over 300 podcasts archived to listen at your own convenience at texasconflictcoach.com or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. To learn about upcoming radio programs and resources, sign up for our monthly e-newsletter.